And to introduce our final distinguished, and I mean most distinguished speaker, is Cynthia McKinney. Come on back up, Cynthia. I can't tell you how happy I am about this next speaker. Look.
I'm happy to get a little sugar from Richard Gage. Okay, there is nothing that gives me more pleasure than presenting a hero of mine. And that hero would be Dr. William Pepper. So now I have this little bio, which I'm going to read, and then I'm going to do a little thing. William Pepper is an international civil rights lawyer holding many titles, including barrister, High Court of England and Wales, and member of the Bar of the Federal District Court of the District of Columbia. He's been trial counsel for many international human rights cases. He previously represented heads of state and governments in East and West Africa, Latin and South America. Okay, and so now gets to the very, very important part for me. And that is because I'm from Georgia and in politics, I couldn't help but be affected by the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I wanted to have answers to my questions about why Dr. King was killed and who killed him. And William Pepper was one of the persons, actually the person, who answered my questions, because he represented this 1999 trial in December of that year, where the jury found the United States government guilty of criminal conspiracy in the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Everything that you think you might know about how Dr. King was killed, it isn't. The truth, however, is contained in this book. And then he didn't stop there. He went on to now, he represents Sirhan Sirhan in the investigation of the murder of Bobby Kennedy. To speak to us today.
Thank you, Cynthia. I've come here this afternoon really to pay respect to Richard Gage and the architects and engineers for all they have done to try to shed light in American history. I think it goes without saying that the world has become a very different place since 9/11 took itself upon us. I think the speakers, I'm sure, have said there are so many unanswered questions that lay among us and give a great deal of discomfort, particularly to the widows and the orphans of many of the people who died on that day. 9/11 is also an important day south of the border. Many of you know. It is the history of the beginning of the horrific dictatorial rule of Pinochet and the assassination of Salvador Allende, first democratically elected socialist in Chilean and South American history. Now, so we share the commemoration of this day with our Chilean comrades and brothers and sisters. And it's important to remember that. Throughout most of organized society's history of human beings on this planet, the masters of society have used a variety of tactics and techniques to dominate and control the masses of their people. Remember, there are two roads to power. One is money, the other is numbers. And if they can control, well, they certainly control the money, and they have the money, but if they cannot control the numbers, then there will be substantive, meaningful change. But if they can divide, if they can disinform, if they can desensitize masses of people and keep the numbers down and splintered apart and subvert them, then they will continue, these masters, to rule over us as they have modern society of human social organization. Now, what are their tactics? One major important tactic, of course, is disinformation and misinformation. And they do everything they can to propagate and perpetuate that reality, so that the people are not really aware of what is going on and what has happened. This aspect of education of the masses begins at a very early age. I brought my 3-year-old today. She fell asleep in the car on the way here, so she's still sleeping in the car with a babysitter. The concern I have for them and for the 3 children of my earlier marriage who were raised in England is that the early education is so terribly important. And in this country, from beginning to end of the educational system, there is a mantra and there is disinformation. I left America for 20 years when I worked on the King case. I left it because of the threats not only on me, but most particularly on my children, and they didn't need to be raised in that kind of environment. So I took them to England. They were raised at Cambridge. Eventually I went to teach at the other place, Oxford. But they were excluded from a lot of what I'm afraid most of our children in this country cannot avoid. So disinformation begins in the educational system, but then it goes on and is perpetuated in terms of media. Now, we know what happens with media. Going back to the beginning of this republic, the official public news that comes out is sanitized, and it is made acceptable for the masses to have. 1915, J.P. Morgan decided they had to be formalized, and so he identified 70 newspapers that had to be controlled. And that started the formal control 2 years after the Federal Reserve Bank was created, which is not a public institution, as you know, not a real central bank, right, but a bank owned by 11 other private institutions. So to protect and preserve that, away from characters like Andrew Jackson, who wanted to do away with it a century earlier, they started to control the media then. They continued the control of the media down to the present day. And how they do it is how Carl Bernstein, actually, in a moment of some weakness, taught us they did it and do it by having over 400 people engaged in the major media corporations, from stringers up to publishers. The key people, editors who doesn't get printed. So the print media is well under wraps. His grandfather gave Allen Dulles 12 slots on the New York Times in 1959. Those 12 slots on the New York Times have been rotated by different people. We begin off and on to understand who some of them are. Some of them are very deep cover journalists. very much with a liberal orientation and bent. So that therefore, when they say the government is right about something, people will say, oh, well, it must be so, because look at what so-and-so has said. Right. So that's the reality of print. Then comes along cable. And here we thought, well, there's a breath of fresh air, right? Here we have cable. And look at what has happened to cable television, how it's been gobbled up and how it's controlled. So the Richard Gages of this world, who work so hard to bring out the truth, not only about Building 7, but about the ramifications of the entire debacle, are never heard really in the mainstream. It's very rare. One major anchor said to me at one point, he said, Bill, it's just not worth my job. I've got 2 kids to raise, and I have all these problems. I just can't do it. And that's the common perspective of people who get co-opted and who have mortgages and who have children to educate. They are brought into the fold, and they will not go astray, except in rare instances, and then they're sent to Coventry. Brian Gumbel made a mistake once. He interviewed me for 2 segments rather than 1. He said, come back. I was sitting. He said, I don't want you to come back. I want you to stay for the second segment after we were going over the King matter. And he was very hostile in the first segment. But in the second segment, somehow something clicked with him. And he canceled his next guest. And so we spent another 7 minutes. And the hostility went away and the questions were more significant. Well, Bryant was soon after that, it's history, offered a job at CBS. He goes off to CBS. He lasts there for a little while, because that, of course, is the road that what in England we call, or Ireland even, we call Coventry. So off Bryant goes from CBS, and what is he doing today? I hope making a good living, but certainly not having the impact that he could have had. Okay, so the visual media, the cable media slowly gets wrapped up, and they will not entertain these kinds of issues. So we've lost, of course, network, and now we've lost cable. And now we have internet primarily. And of course, they're going to do everything they can to control the internet and to infiltrate it and to subvert it. So that's the next target in terms of disinformation, misinformation that gets put out there for the people. So that's number 1. That has been used since the Sumerians. This tactic of misinforming and manipulating has been used since the Sumerians. Yeah, I'm removing this from the indigenous people who occupied this planet long before any of us, but ancient societies, Greece and Rome, were controlled the very same way that this population is being controlled. So that's number 1. Number 2, what do they do? What is the second thing that they do? Well, there is such a thing as false flags. How many of you know what a false flag operation is? This country has had more than its share of false flags, hasn't it? It had its false flags back, going way back to the Maine and the Philippines and on forward. But then, in 1963, it had a false flag that related to the overthrow of the elected Mossadegh in Iran, so that Anglo-Americans could control that oil. That was a false flag connected with that operation. Then there were, in more closer proximity to us, there was the Gulf of Tonkin false flag. How many of you remember what the Gulf of Tonkin was all about? Look at that. The Gulf of Tonkin, of course, Mr. Johnson said, was an attack on American ship by the Vietnamese, and therefore we had to go to war against Vietnam. So he used the Gulf of Tonkin as Oklahoma City. And I dare say I have not been involved in the type of research that Richard and his people have with respect to not only Building 7, but 9/11 in general. But I dare say that the Marat building, from those whom I know who are close to it, was clearly another false flag, as probably was the first World Trade Center bombing. Right? So that is what they do. They raise false flags to mobilize public support for all kinds of nefarious operations. These masters, these people who never really come forward, these people who are in the background but who buy and sell the elected representatives, and more importantly, the intelligence and law enforcement officials who become their foot soldiers. So here's the danger. The danger is that the work of Richard Gage, the architects and engineers, and the work of all the other people who have come forward and tried to relay the truth and the work that I have done with respect to Dr. King's assassination, because Martin and I were very close to the last year of his life. And Bob Kennedy, I ran Bob Kennedy's campaign as a citizens chairman as a kid in Westchester County in '64 when he ran for the Senate in the state. So Bobby and I also had that. So in these two cases, there's a bit of a personal attachment. But all the work that we do, the 9/11, thing that they do to keep the population, all leaders, when they reach where they are serious threats, only when do they use it. They do it. They killed Martin because it happened to people to Washington, not to walk, no marches anymore. And they were going to the Hill and talk to their representatives. To a revolution which they had to kill Martin. They would never let him leave Memphis. But because he was going to reopen, he was going to quit the oil depletion allowance and end it forever. Bobby was too dangerous. They had to kill him. And I'm into the third political assassination. I avoided it for 2 years, but finally Peter Janney convinced me, after following me for 2 years, he convinced me to please me on this case. A child who was nurtured by a woman called Mary Meyer. She's the most important woman in 20th century American history. He told Kenny O'Donnell he was going to marry her after the second term. She was in the White House 40 times before they killed her. Mary Meyer turned John Kennedy into a warrior for peace, as opposed to an advocate for the Cold War. She had turned him around so much that it scared a lot of the people around the president. She had been married to Corbett, the director of the CIA. Divorced him in 1957, took up with Jack Kennedy in 1961. That story. When they killed Jack Kennedy, she waited for the Warren Commission report to come out. When it came out, she was appalled, and she did something that perhaps prudently she should not have done. She went to her former husband, and she said to him, if you and your buddies do not reveal how Jack Kennedy was really killed, I am going to blow the whistle on you and Jim Angleton, father of 3 of her children, senior CIA guard. So they couldn't allow that to happen, and so she was assassinated. It was a political assassination on a towpath in Georgetown, Washington. Today, unsolved murder. They found a black guy. They tried to pin it on him, and it didn't work. And so it's an unsolved murder. So we have taken that case, had trials. filed a lawsuit Friday against, thank you, against the CIA operative who we play in the assassination. Okay, so they disinform, they do everything they can to divide, they use false flags to raise the consciousness of a population, and ultimately they co-opt if they can, and they kill if it becomes necessary. And someone who wants to be co-opted, like Pete, for a better part of a decade, and you're never allowed to record to sing the American people, and he's well into his. So now the danger that the work we've done on political assassinations with respect to Trump will be swept into the rubbish bin of history as they try to outlast us. The danger to figure out how to put these truths so that future generations, we have to be about. Okay, thank you all for coming here.
Awesome. Dr. William Pepper. Thank you, everybody. I would like to make a final comment and let you know that you can help in other ways as well with the Rethink 911 campaign phase 1 and 2, and that is join one of the 70 teams that we are setting up, volunteer teams. We have over 100 people that volunteer weekly on the telephone. We're getting together doing things that you cannot do alone, that together we can do and make a mighty thrust for a huge and important purpose. So remember the AE911truth.org link. Go to Take Action and join us. And one of the teams, we need your help. We've got a mighty work to do. And with that, I would like to invite you to start that work tonight at Langley's. If you haven't had all Langens, right behind you, take a look behind you, that green sign there. We're going to crowd them out tonight with dinner. And come and ask all your questions. Most of our speakers will be there. So come and join us, and we will drink into the night. Thanks, everybody. You're an incredible audience. And thank you, New York, and the Police Department of New York for being such an incredible, awesome partner in this rally. Thank you.